Well, hey there everybody, it's Snackbox coming to you from a beautiful and sunshiny day down here in Basement Studio. I'm really excited to be here today talking to you about the differences between the John Muir Trail and the Colorado Trail. These are two trails that a lot of people like to talk about in the same breath because they generally can be finished in about the same time, somewhere within a month. John Muir Trail is a little bit faster overall because it's about half the distance of the Colorado Trail, but they're both pretty comparable trails because they are great starting points for you if you are thinking about getting into long distance hiking and through hiking. Both of them present really great opportunities for you to get out there in the woods, and we're going to talk today about all the major differences between the two and some of the things that make them really similar and all the things that make them really special. So we've got a lot to cover, not a lot of time. Let's get to it, everybody. So in 2018, I had the good fortune of being able to hike the John Muir Trail. Then in 2020, I was able to hike 400 miles of the Colorado Trail, and last year I was able to hike the full distance from Denver to Durango of the Colorado Trail. And in the previous summers, I've done things like the Collegiate Loop in 2015, and I hiked all the way from Monarch Pass all the way down to Durango, that 230-mile stretch, way back in 2016. So I've had a pretty good experience with both of these trails, but Colorado Trail is certainly my primary love. As any of you who know anything about my channel know, I absolutely adore the Colorado Trail, but I think both of these are really special trails, and one of the first questions people like to ask me is which one is harder? And that's a really tough question to ask because ultimately here you've got the John Muir Trail comes in at about 211 miles. It has 46,700 feet of elevation gain, and that means it averages somewhere in the ballpark of about 221 feet per mile. It's a pretty decent amount of elevation gain over the course of those 211 miles. Now the Colorado Trail, in contrast, is more than twice as long. It's 486 miles and it goes up in elevation 82,000 feet, but it averages 169 feet of elevation gain per mile. So it's significantly less elevation gain per mile. And overall, what I also like to tell people is that the Colorado Trail tends to be much better graded by way of switchbacks in the trail itself. So a lot of people find that if they go out to the John Muir Trail and they're averaging, like I did, about 16, 17 miles a day, when they get out to the Colorado Trail, they can often average many more miles per day. I've seen people go from 17 miles a day on the John Muir Trail, kicking it up to about 23, 24 miles a day on average of the Colorado Trail. So they're very different trails by way of the average amount of elevation gain and fall. Overall, I would say that they're relatively similar trails, but if forced to answer that, I do think the John Muir Trail is harder on average, and it's also a little bit tougher because the John Muir Trail is cut into granite in a lot of different places, and so you often have these places where you have big steep steps where the Colorado Trail is cut into some granite as well, of course, but it doesn't tend to have those big sort of 1.5 to 2 foot steps where you really have to navigate this sort of descent like on Glen Pass, going up or down depending on if you're going Nobo or Sobo near the Great Lakes area. Now these are all really relative, and you may find people who say that the John Muir Trail was easier. I've seen that for sure, but I think overall in my experience, I found the Colorado Trail to be one where I can put in bigger miles on average. Now that brings us to one of our other big differences, and this is really pertinent to those of you thinking about starting a big hike. So considering either going on the John Muir Trail or doing the Colorado Trail as your first big hike, and that is ultimately the number of road crossings that you're going to have and opportunities to resupply. The John Muir Trail goes about 211 miles without ever crossing a paved or unpaved road. It is really remarkable how little you get any sort of human contact throughout that. So resupply is often much more difficult because you either have to send in an expensive resupply to Muir Trail Ranch or Vermilion Valley Resort, or you have to leave the trail and hike 16, 17 miles over the Onion Valley Pass and go out to a town like Bishop. Now those are really reasonable, generally speaking, for most people. If you're trying to hike the trail in about 2 or 3 weeks, it's really pretty possible for most people to do that. Now the Colorado Trail, in contrast, has a number of road crossings. In fact, most days on the Colorado Trail, you will cross at least a Forest Service road, which will afford you an opportunity to hitch out should you need something. So it's a lot easier in that respect to get in and out of town because you're going to be around a lot of people who are going into the woods to start a hike or do some camping trips, and they will see you with that big backpack and be more likely to pick you up to take you into town. One of the things that could send you into town is if you get caught in a rainstorm, and this is one of the primary differences. It is not written in stone. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of storms being similar but very different in a lot of respects. Every year I've done the Colorado Trail or some section of it, it's been in July or maybe a little bit into June, but that really heads into what people call monsoon season. Effectively what this means is any day you stand the very high likelihood of running into very serious rain, whereas the John Muir Trail generally is known as being much drier. Now, just a caveat, the year I did the John Muir Trail in 2018, I ran into torrential rain 6 days in a row, including one day where it hailed on us so hard that my hiking buddy and I had to sit and wait for the hail to melt because we couldn't even see the trail. And that was pretty atypical though. Generally speaking, the John Muir Trail sees a lot less rain than the Colorado Trail, especially because you do it in a much shorter window. So even if it rains every day, it's much less rain overall. But the Colorado Trail tends to see a lot more rain, especially heading into July and as July develops and progresses. And that's not the only major difference in terms of the natural phenomena that happen out on the trail, and one of the big differences between the two is the amount of scenery and the way that it develops. Now, the John Muir Trail, of course, goes through the Sierra Nevada, so you're going to see a lot more of those sort of granite domes. You'll see a lot more rock exposure, a lot more of those mountain lakes, and so you're going to see quite a bit different landscape and scenery throughout the time that you hike the John Muir Trail, whereas the Colorado Trail runs the gamut. You'll see some areas like Sergeant's Mesa, you'll see Snow Mesa, where you're up on these beautiful snowy mesas, right? And so you'll also pass through Waterson Canyon, which is really flat and dry. You're going to go through the burn zone in segment 2, which is super dry, so some almost desert-like conditions. And then as you get into the San Juans, you're going to get into some really high alpine kind of environments, and you'll have all these different environments that you're going to pass. So the environments are much more diverse overall on the Colorado Trail, whereas the landscapes on the John Muir Trail tend to be much more condensed. Everywhere you go on the John Muir Trail could be a postcard, hands down 100%. The Colorado Trail has enormous amounts of beautiful scenery, but overall there will be some stretches where you'll pass through some areas where you might not feel like it's necessarily postcard worthy. So some people might love that stretch going into the Gunnison Basin, but it's pretty flat and it's very different than the Colorado that most people think of when they think of hiking the Colorado Trail. So there's a lot more diversity in landscape, but there's a lot more concentration of those scenes on the John Muir Trail. Don't get me wrong, they are both incredible, and obviously I go out every summer and hike the Colorado Trail because it is so breathtakingly beautiful. So really all I'm saying here is about the number of miles you walk where you're looking around and just absolutely floored by everything that surrounds you. It's very different by way of the Colorado Trail versus the John Muir Trail, but they are both stunning and they are both absolutely remarkable landscapes, and you will love them both. Promise you that. Now, one of the big push factors that gets people to hike the Colorado Trail and choose the Colorado Trail, even though it's longer than the John Muir Trail, is that the permitting system is much, much easier. In fact, if you decide to hike the Colorado Trail and go the Collegiate West alternate, you don't need a permit at all, and you only need a permit if you go east through that Clear Creek Reservoir area. The John Muir Trail, by contrast, is much, much harder to get a permit, especially if you are determined to go southbound. Going southbound requires that you enter a lottery and you keep staying on it. Based on my really poor math calculations, the John Muir Trail lottery system turns down a ballpark of about 2,500 to 3,000 permit applications per day when they are picking those lottery applications. So it's really, really hard. It's a little bit easier to get a permit going northbound because you don't apply through Yosemite National Park, you apply through Inyo National Forest, and it can be a lot easier to get a permit going northbound, but a lot of people really want that symbolic finish on top of Mount Whitney. It's one of those factors that a lot of people consider when they think about maybe waiting a year or two to hike the John Muir Trail and then go take off and do the Colorado Trail instead. The permits are very, very different, and the John Muir Trail starts in a national park, it ends in a national park, and passes through wilderness areas, so it's a lot stricter for things like mountain bikes. You're not going to see nearly as many dogs on trail. You're certainly not going to see any mountain bikes on that trail. So basically what you're going to see is that it's easier to get onto the Colorado Trail and to be able to hike that one really within any time frame that you want to start and finish. It's much easier to plan that for the Colorado Trail because you don't have to wait for that permit to see if you're going to win the lottery, and so it's a lot easier to plan overall. Now, one of the most important regulation differences between the Colorado Trail and the John Muir Trail is that bear canister. Bear canisters are not just required on the John Muir Trail, but they are absolutely essential on the John Muir Trail. In fact, there's one bear in Sequoia National Park that knows how to knock a bear canister off of the cliff so that it breaks at the bottom and then it gets your food at the bottom. So not only is it really required, but you have to know how to use a bear canister so you don't end up losing your food still. On the Colorado Trail, in contrast, bear problems have only begun to surface, so bear care and bear awareness is still very important, but it is still not a requirement to carry a bear canister or even an sack at this point, and counterbalancing is still allowed, so hanging your food from a tree is still allowed on the Colorado Trail, whereas that wouldn't fly on the John Muir Trail. One of the other things that I like to tell people about the difference between the two is the idea of crowds. The John Muir Trail gets an absolute ton of traffic every single year. In fact, I went northbound on it and I was really frustrated by the end of it because I had to keep stepping off trail so that people could pass me going southbound. It was really, really tough because there were so many people and so much pressure on that area that it created a lot of problems by way of the ecosystem. It's why the permit system is required, or else that place would just be absolutely flooded. The Colorado Trail is very different in that it is not only bigger, but it's also one where people tend to hike in the same direction. So a lot of people go southbound. It's very rare to see anybody go northbound. So in fact, while there are crowds, maybe even bigger crowds on the Colorado Trail, it doesn't tend to feel that way because you generally go with the flow of traffic. Even if you're on the John Muir Trail going southbound, the sort of traditional route that you won the permit for, you'll still be passing PCT hikers going northbound. So there's just a ton of traffic because the John Muir Trail shares quite a bit of its footpath with the PCT in the same way that the Colorado Trail shares a footpath with the CDT, but the CDT is much more seldomly traveled than the PCT. So basically you get this sort of concentration of hikers on the John Muir Trail, and so it is very, very crowded compared especially to the Colorado Trail, which can be crowded and you can always find somebody to hike with, but it tends to be sort of everybody going in the same direction, so it doesn't quite feel as crowded in my personal opinion. And the last thing here is about the time frame that it takes to hike it. When I did the John Muir Trail, it took me about 12 days to hike it, and the last time I hiked the Colorado Trail, it took me about 24 trail days to hike it. So I think generally speaking, they're in about the same window of time. Some people might only have 2 weeks of vacation, so the John Muir Trail would be the move for sure. And some of you might have a full month of July off and be a teacher like me and be able to go out for as long as you want. And so a month is really reasonable to do either of these trails. But ultimately, I do think you could do either of these trails in about 3.5 weeks. So that's sort of the sweet spot where they overlap, specifically because the John Muir Trail does tend to have really aggressive climbs over those passes and the storms are pushing in. You do tend to go over a mountain pass every single day on the John Muir Trail, where the Colorado Trail tends to have a few days where you will maybe hike to the next mountain pass and have a little bit of space between, so you don't end up having to wait on one side of the mountain pass for a storm to pass, that kind of thing, or if it looks threatening, you don't have to wait it out for the next morning to get over early. Big thing though is those stream crossings and river crossings. The Colorado Trail tends to have many more bridges that go over the bigger rivers, and you won't necessarily run into a big river like you do with Evolution Creek, which is really big and can be really scary. In fact, there's an alternate route to take if the water is high, and I would encourage you all to think about that if you do the John Muir Trail, because the number one killer of hikers is water crossings and people getting swept down river, so you want to be especially careful there. Colorado Trail has very few really big river crossings. You'll cross plenty of creeks, but they're not going to be big enough to sweep you down river. And if they are big enough to sweep you down river, you're going to find a bridge there because the Colorado Trail Foundation does a really good job of building those for people so they can get across safely. Let's go with the last thing to know, because I got more for you, everybody. So the last thing to know here is that water is very different on both trails. The Colorado Trail has some stretches where you'll go upwards of 21 miles without a water resupply, and that can be really tough for people because you have to carry that water. John Muir Trail, with all those water crossings, will also mean it'll have lots of opportunities where you can get water or camp near water, so you won't necessarily need to carry nearly as much water on average through the John Muir Trail because it's almost everywhere throughout the whole trail. So it makes it a little bit easier by way of planning that. Trade-off, of course, is it's much harder to get food on the John Muir Trail and get resupply, but on the Colorado Trail, there are a lot more places where you need to be really careful about water supply and making sure you have plenty to get through those stretches, like segment 2, where you'll go 10 miles without a water resupply in the heat of the day with the sun beating down and no coverage. A lot of different things to consider here, but ultimately what I would say is the best trail for you is the one that you can hike. Get out there, enjoy these trails, they're beautiful, and then find a way to give give back. Whatever it is, give back. Try to give back to that community in any way, shape, or form so we can keep this community rich and vibrant. Take good care of those trails, practice leave no trace, and remember, hit that like and subscribe button because nobody cares more about you than me. Or probably your family, maybe your dogs. You get the idea. There are probably a lot of people care more about you, but I still like you. So click that like and subscribe. Stick around. We'll be talking about all sorts of Colorado Trail stuff this week. Can't wait to talk to you all. And remember, if you haven't already, send me a message on Instagram at Backcountry Champion. Say, hey, Snackbox, hit me up with one of those outside comfort zone stickers, and I will get one of these sweet potatoes out in the mail to you this week. Let me know where to send it, and I will talk to you all soon. That's it, everybody. This Snackbox out. Take care.